At 30,000 feet, when all hope died, she stood up from row 17. Welcome to Tales by Orion. Let's uncover what really happened. The cabin of Sterling Valerius Airways Flight 714 hummed with a monotonous, almost soporific drone of a long-haul journey. At 30,000 feet, somewhere over the vast, indifferent expanse of the Atlantic, the world outside was a breathtaking, yet strangely abstract, tapestry of brilliant blue sky and a sea of pristine, white clouds. Inside, however, the atmosphere was a study in mundane, everyday humanity. Passengers lost in the flickering blue light of their seat back screens, flight attendants moving with a practiced, almost robotic grace, their smiles as standardized as the pre-packaged meals they served. Among these anonymous travelers, in a cramped, unremarkable seat in row 17, sat Alara Hayes, a young woman whose quiet, unassuming demeanor blended seamlessly into the beige upholstery of her surroundings. At 24, Alara was a woman accustomed to being invisible, to moving through the world with a quiet, almost apologetic efficiency. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple, functional ponytail. Her clothes were practical, comfortable, chosen for their anonymity rather than their style. Her dark, intelligent eyes, however, held a flicker of something more, a quiet, observant intensity that missed nothing, that saw beyond the surface of things, that seemed to understand the intricate, often unseen, mechanics of the world around her. They were the eyes of a scholar, of a dreamer, of a woman whose true passion lay not in the mundane realities of her everyday life, but in the elegant, irrefutable, and often beautiful logic of flight. Alara was on her way to a new life, a new job, a new city, a new attempt to outrun the long, persistent shadow of family tragedy that had derailed her dreams and left her with a profound, almost paralyzing fear of everything. She had once been a brilliant, promising aerospace engineering student, her mind soaring among the complex equations of aerodynamics, her future bright with the promise of designing, of building, of perhaps, one day, even flying the magnificent, winged beast that now carried her so effortlessly through the heavens. But life, with its cruel, indifferent twists, had grounded her. A devastating accident, a profound loss, and the sudden, crushing weight of a grief so overwhelming it had shattered her confidence. Her ambition, her very sense of self, had forced her to abandon her studies, to trade her textbooks for a soul-crushing, dead-end job in data entry, to retreat into a small, safe, and profoundly beige world of her own making. This journey, this flight, was her first tentative step back into the light, a desperate and frankly terrifying attempt to reclaim a part of the life she had lost, to find a new, albeit more modest, dream to pursue. She clutched the armrests of her seat, her knuckles white, her heart a nervous, fluttering bird against her ribs. She hated flying, hated the feeling of powerlessness, of being a mere passenger in a complex, powerful machine whose inner workings she understood, perhaps better than anyone on this plane, including, she suspected, the pilots themselves. She knew, intimately, the physics of lift, the mechanics of thrust, the intricate dance of hydraulics and avionics that kept this massive, metal bird aloft. She knew the thousands of things that could go wrong, the subtle, almost imperceptible signs of mechanical stress, of system failure that could, in a matter of moments, transform this routine, mundane journey into a catastrophic and utterly final disaster. And so, she listened. She listened not to the in-flight movie, not to the hushed chatter of her fellow passengers, but to the hum of the engines, to the subtle vibrations of the airframe, to the almost imperceptible shifts in the cabin pressure. She listened to the secret, silent language of the machine, a language she had once loved, a language that now filled her with a profound, almost paralyzing anxiety. In the cockpit, Captain Henderson, a veteran pilot with thousands of flight hours and a calm, almost laconic demeanor, oversaw the routine, uneventful journey. His co-pilot, a younger, more eager, but equally competent man named Miller, handled the communications. His voice a steady, professional drone in the quiet, almost sterile environment of the flight deck. It was a perfect day for flying. A clear sky, a smooth ride, a tailwind that promised an early arrival. Nothing, absolutely nothing, to indicate the sudden, catastrophic, and utterly unprecedented event that was about to unfold. An event that would shatter the mundane tranquility of Flight 714, that would plunge its 300 passengers into a terrifying life-or-death struggle for survival. And that would, in the most unexpected, most improbable of ways, force a quiet, unassuming, and deeply terrified young woman in row 17 to confront her own, long-buried demons, and to reclaim the fierce, brilliant, and ultimately life-saving genius she had thought long lost. The journey was about to take a turn, a terrifying, precipitous, and utterly life-altering turn. And Alara Hayes, the forgotten scholar, the reluctant passenger, the woman who knew too much, was about to find herself at the very heart of the storm. The first sign of trouble was not a bang, not a shudder, not a sudden, violent lurch. It was a silence, a profound, unnatural, and deeply terrifying silence. The monotonous, reassuring hum of the engines, the constant, almost subliminal vibration of the airframe, the very lifeblood of the massive, winged beast that had been carrying them so effortlessly through the heavens, simply ceased. One moment, they were suspended in the sky, a triumph of human ingenuity, of mechanical precision. The next, they were a glider. A very large, very heavy, and very, very fast glider. A collective gasp went through the cabin, a wave of dawning, horrified comprehension. Passengers looked up from their movies, from their books, their faces a mixture of confusion, of disbelief, of a rapidly escalating, almost primal fear. The flight attendants, their own faces pale beneath their professional masks, exchanged wide-eyed, terrified glances. The soft, classical music that had been piping through the cabin speakers was suddenly, blessedly, replaced by the calm, authoritative, yet undeniably strained voice of Captain Henderson. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice a little too loud, a little too forced in the sudden, unnerving silence. "This is your captain speaking. We appear to be experiencing a minor technical issue, a temporary loss of power. Please remain calm and return to your seats. The flight crew is addressing the situation. We will have you on your way shortly." But Alara Hayes, in her cramped, unremarkable seat in row 17, knew better. She knew this was not a minor technical issue. This was not a temporary loss of power. This was a catastrophic and likely total engine failure. A double flameout. A 1 in a billion occurrence. An eventuality so rare, so improbable, that it was considered a statistical impossibility. A ghost in the machine of modern aviation. Her mind, her brilliant, analytical, and now terrifyingly prescient mind raced. She calculated their altitude, their airspeed, their rate of descent. She saw, with a chilling, undeniable clarity, the stark, brutal mathematics of their situation. They were falling, not in a panicked, chaotic spiral, but in a long, graceful, and utterly, terrifyingly inexorable glide towards the vast, indifferent expanse of the Atlantic Ocean, still thousands of miles from the nearest landmass. She felt a wave of nausea, of a cold, clammy, and utterly paralyzing fear wash over her. This was it. The very scenario that had haunted her nightmares for years. The very reason she had abandoned her dreams, her passion, her life. She was going to die. Here, in this cold, silent, metal tube, hurtling towards a watery grave. She closed her eyes, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps, her hands gripping the armrest with a force that threatened to shatter the plastic. She heard the rising panic around her, the nervous whispers, the muffled sobs, the frantic, almost hysterical questions of her fellow passengers. She heard the flight attendants, their voices now strained, their reassurances sounding increasingly hollow as they moved through the cabin, their own fear a palpable, almost tangible thing. In the cockpit, Captain Henderson and his co-pilot, Miller, were engaged in their own desperate and increasingly futile battle. They ran through the emergency checklists, their movements precise, professional, yet tinged with a dawning, almost overwhelming sense of despair. The engines would not restart. The backup systems were failing. The plane was a dead weight in the sky, a magnificent technological marvel transformed, in an instant, into a very large, very expensive coffin. Mayday, 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 Miller's voice, now stripped of its earlier, confident drone, crackled over the radio, a desperate, lonely plea in the vast, empty sky. Sterling Valerius Flight 714. We have a catastrophic dual-engine failure. We are going down. The words so stark, so final, so utterly devastatingly hopeless, seemed to suck the very air from the cockpit. Henderson, his face ashen, his hands gripping the controls of the now unresponsive aircraft, stared out at the endless, indifferent expanse of blue sky and white clouds, a profound, almost spiritual sense of his own and his passengers' mortality washing over him. This was it. The end. There was nothing more they could do. They were at the mercy of gravity, of fate, of a cold, hard, and utterly unforgiving reality. But in row 17, amidst the rising tide of panic and despair, something within Alara Hayes began to shift. The fear, the paralysis, the overwhelming, suffocating weight of her own, long-held, personal trauma began to recede, replaced by something else. Something familiar. Something powerful. Her mind, her brilliant, analytical, and now, strangely, almost preternaturally calm mind began to work. She saw not just the problem, but the system. The complex, interconnected, and now profoundly failing system of the aircraft. She saw the variables, the dependencies, the subtle, almost invisible cascade of failures that had led to this catastrophic event. And she saw possibility, a slim, almost infinitesimal chance, a desperate, audacious, and utterly insane idea. An idea that defied all protocols, all conventions, all reason. An idea that would require not just her knowledge, not just her intellect, but a courage, a recklessness, a willingness to step out of the shadows, to shatter her silence, to confront her own deepest, most terrifying fears in a way she had never, ever imagined. The plane was falling. The passengers were praying. The pilots had given up hope. And Alara Hayes, the quiet, unassuming, and deeply terrified young woman in row 17, was about to make a decision. A decision that would not just change her own life, but would determine the fate of every single soul on Sterling Valerius Flight 714. The decision, when it came, was not a conscious choice, not a rational calculation of risk and reward. It was a primal, almost instinctual response, the reaction of a brilliant mind refusing to surrender to the cold, hard, and seemingly inevitable mathematics of disaster. Alara Hayes, her fear now eclipsed by a strange, almost preternatural calm, unbuckled her seatbelt. The movement, so simple, so decisive, in the midst of the rising tide of panic and despair that was now sweeping through the cabin, sent a ripple of astonished silence through her immediate neighbors. They stared at her, their faces a mixture of confusion, of fear, of a dawning, almost incredulous, hope. What was she doing? What could she possibly do? She stood up, her small, unassuming figure a stark, solitary beacon of calm in the chaotic, fear-filled cabin. She ignored the frantic, almost hysterical, attempts of a nearby flight attendant to get her to sit back down. "Ma'am, please, you must return to your seat. It's not safe." But Alara simply met the young woman's terrified gaze, her own dark, intelligent eyes holding a quiet, unwavering, and deeply surprising authority. "I need to get to the cockpit," Alara said, her voice calm, steady, imbued with a confidence she did not feel, but which she knew she had to project. Now, the flight attendant stared at her, her jaw slack, her mind struggling to process the sheer, unadulterated audacity of the request. The cockpit? Ma'am, that's impossible. It's against all regulations. No one is allowed in the cockpit during an emergency. The regulations, miss, Alara replied, her voice still quiet but now laced with an icy precision that cut through the young woman's panic, were written for conventional emergencies. This is not a conventional emergency. The pilots, they have given up. I heard it on the radio. They have declared Mayday. They believe we are going down. But they are wrong. There is still a chance. A very small chance. But a chance nonetheless. And I am, perhaps, the only person on this plane who knows how to take it. Now please, she said, her gaze unwavering, get me to the cockpit, or we are all, I assure you, going to die. Her words so stark, so direct, so utterly, terrifyingly convincing, seemed to shock the flight attendant out of her own, fear-induced paralysis. She looked at Alara, at her calm, intelligent eyes, at the unwavering conviction in her voice, and she saw not a hysterical passenger, but a leader, a woman of profound, almost unnerving authority. She made a decision, a reckless, protocol-defying, and potentially career-ending decision. She nodded. This way, she whispered, her own voice a mixture of terror and a dawning, almost religious awe. She led Alara through the crowded, increasingly chaotic aisle towards the front of the plane, towards the locked and supposedly impenetrable door of the cockpit. The other flight attendants, the passengers, stared as they passed, their faces a mixture of confusion, of hope, of a dawning, almost superstitious belief that something extraordinary was about to happen. In the cockpit, Captain Henderson and his co-pilot, Miller, had indeed all but surrendered to their fate. They had exhausted every emergency procedure, every checklist, every desperate, last-ditch attempt to restart the dead engines. They were now simply waiting for the inevitable, brutal, and final impact with the cold, indifferent sea below. The sudden, insistent buzzing of the cockpit door intercom startled them both. Who in God's name is that? Henderson growled, his voice rough with despair. Miller activated the small, grainy, black and white video screen that showed the area outside the cockpit door. He saw the flight attendant, her face pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and a strange, almost manic hope. And beside her, a young woman, a passenger, her face calm, her gaze fixed directly on the camera with a quiet, unnerving, and deeply surprising intensity. Captain, the flight attendant's voice, trembling but clear, crackled over the intercom. There's a passenger here. A young woman. She says she can help. She says she knows what to do. Henderson let out a harsh, bitter laugh. Help? What can a passenger do? Tell us to pray? Offer us a last-minute confession? Tell her to go back to her seat and prepare for impact? But Miller, his own hope, however faint, however irrational, momentarily rekindled, hesitated. He looked at the woman on the screen, at her calm, intelligent eyes, at the unwavering conviction in her gaze. Captain, he said, his voice a low, urgent whisper, what if she does know something? We have nothing to lose. We are out of options. Henderson stared at the screen, at the small, unassuming woman who stood so calmly, so confidently, in the face of their impending doom. He thought of his own family, of his children, of the life he was about to lose. And he thought of the 300 souls in the cabin behind him, their lives, their futures, now resting, quite literally, in his and his co-pilot's hands. He had given up. He had accepted their fate. But this woman, this strange, improbable, and utterly captivating woman, she had not. And in her eyes, he saw not the frantic, desperate hope of a delusional passenger, but the quiet, confident, and deeply unnerving competence of an expert, a professional, a fellow pilot. Open the door, Miller, Captain Henderson said finally, his voice a ragged, almost choked, a whisper a man who had just been offered a single, fragile, and utterly unbelievable straw to clutch at in a vast, overwhelming sea of despair. Let's hear what the lady has to say. The cockpit door hissed open, revealing Alara Hayes, her small, unassuming figure framed in the doorway, her dark, intelligent eyes fixed on the two stunned pilots, her face a mask of quiet, unwavering, and deeply, terrifyingly professional calm. The quiet girl from row 17 had just taken control, and the fate of Flight 714 and of every single soul on board now rested, for better or for worse, in her small, capable, and surprisingly steady hands. The scene inside the cockpit was one of controlled, yet palpable, despair. Captain Henderson and his co-pilot, Miller, stared at Alara, their faces a mixture of disbelief, of a dawning, almost superstitious hope, and of a profound, professional, and deeply humbling shock. A passenger? A civilian? In the cockpit, during a catastrophic in-flight emergency? It was a breach of every protocol, a violation of every regulation, a scenario so utterly unprecedented that it bordered on the surreal. Yet here she was, a quiet, unassuming young woman, standing in the doorway of their technological sanctuary, her gaze calm, her presence imbued with an authority that defied all logic, all explanation. Who are you? Captain Henderson stammered, his voice a hoarse, incredulous whisper. My name is Alara Hayes, she replied, her voice quiet but firm, cutting through the tense, almost sacred silence of the cockpit. And I believe I can help you. The engine failure, it was not a mechanical fault. It was a software anomaly, a subtle, almost invisible bug in the FADEC system, the full authority digital engine control. A bug that was triggered by a specific and highly improbable combination of atmospheric conditions and power settings. It has, in essence, convinced the engines that they are not there, that they have flamed out, when in fact they are perfectly functional. Her explanation, delivered with a calm precision, a breathtaking, almost preternatural confidence, left the two seasoned pilots speechless. They stared at her, their minds struggling to process the sheer, unadulterated, and deeply unsettling brilliance of her diagnosis. A software anomaly? A FADEC bug? It was a theory so esoteric, so complex, so obscure, that it had never even entered their own vast and deeply experienced mental checklists. That's impossible, Miller whispered, his own voice a mixture of awe and a dawning, almost religious, reverence. The FADEC system, it has triple redundancy. It has been tested, simulated for millions of flight hours. It is infallible. Nothing, Mr. Miller, Alara replied, her voice still maddeningly calm, is infallible. Every system, no matter how complex, no matter how redundant, has a ghost in the machine, a hidden vulnerability, a single, elegant, and often devastatingly simple point of failure. And I believe, she paused, her gaze unwavering, that I have found it. She then, with a speed and a precision that was breathtaking to behold, began to outline the solution. It was a complex, counterintuitive, and highly unorthodox sequence of manual overrides, of system reboots, of a delicate, almost surgical manipulation of the plane's complex, interconnected, and now profoundly failing electronic brain. It was a procedure that was not in any manual, not in any emergency checklist, a procedure that defied all conventional aviation wisdom, a procedure that could, if executed incorrectly, send the already crippled aircraft into an unrecoverable, catastrophic death spiral. Henderson and Miller listened, their initial skepticism slowly, surely, being replaced by a dawning, almost terrifying respect. They were pilots, yes. They were masters of their craft. But this woman, she was something else entirely. She was an architect, a composer, a woman who understood not just how to fly the machine, but how to think like the machine. She understood its language, its logic, its soul, in a way they never could. How do you know this? Captain Henderson asked, his voice now a hushed, almost reverent whisper. Who are you, Miss Hayes? Alara met his gaze, a flicker of old, familiar pain in her dark, intelligent eyes. I was once an aerospace engineer, Captain, she said softly. I worked on the design team for the FADEX system on this very aircraft. I was the one who warned them about this specific vulnerability, this ghost in the machine. But my warnings were dismissed as a statistical improbability, a 1 in a billion chance, a risk not worth mitigating. The words hung in the air, a stark, damning indictment of a corporate culture that so often prioritizes profit over precaution, that so often dismisses the quiet, inconvenient truths of its most brilliant, most insightful, and often most junior minds. Henderson stared at her, his face a mask of profound, almost overwhelming comprehension. He remembered the reports, the memos, the hushed, almost forgotten controversy surrounding the FADEX system's development. The young, brilliant engineer whose concerns had been so casually, so arrogantly dismissed. This was her, the ghost, the Cassandra, the woman who had seen the future, who had tried to warn them, who had been ignored. My God, he whispered, his voice thick with a mixture of shame, of regret, and of a dawning, almost spiritual awe. It's you. Alara simply nodded, her expression unreadable. Yes, Captain, it's me. And we are now living my 1 in a billion chance. She then turned her attention to the complex array of controls, of screens, of switches that made up the cockpit's nerve center. We are running out of time, gentlemen, she said, her voice now sharp, commanding, the voice of a leader, a woman in absolute and utter control. We have, I calculate, approximately 12 minutes before we reach an altitude from which recovery will be impossible. The choice is yours. You can follow your protocols, your checklists, your conventional wisdom, and you will, I assure you, crash into the Atlantic Ocean. Or you can trust me. You can let me fly this plane. You can let me fix this. The choice, she repeated, her gaze unwavering, is yours. Captain Henderson looked at his co-pilot, Miller. He saw in his eyes the same mixture of terror, of disbelief, and of a dawning, almost reckless, hope that he felt in his own heart. He looked at the instruments, at the terrifying, undeniable reality of their situation. He looked at the vast, indifferent expanse of the ocean below. And then he looked at Alara Hayes, at her calm, intelligent eyes, at her unwavering confidence, at the profound, almost mystical certainty in her gaze. And he made a decision that defied every rule, every regulation, every instinct of his long, distinguished, and entirely conventional career. She's yours, Miller, he said, his voice a ragged, almost choked whisper. Give her the controls. And in that moment, in that small, silent, and deeply terrified cockpit, high above the unforgiving Atlantic, a new, improbable, and utterly extraordinary kind of pilot took her seat. And the fate of Sterling Valeria's Flight 714, and of every single soul on board, now rested, for better or for worse, in the hands of the quiet, unassuming, and brilliant black girl from row 17. The transfer of control in the cockpit of Flight 714 was a moment of profound, almost surreal, and deeply, terrifyingly quiet drama. Captain Henderson, his face a mask of grim, almost prayerful, resignation, unbuckled his seatbelt and moved, with a surprising, almost cat-like, agility, into the small space behind the pilot's seats. Miller, the co-pilot, his own face ashen, his hands trembling slightly, did the same. And Alara Hayes, the quiet, unassuming passenger, the forgotten aerospace engineer, slid into the captain's seat, her movements fluid, precise, almost familiar. Her hands, small, delicate, yet surprisingly strong, moved over the complex array of controls, of switches, of screens, not with the hesitant, fumbling uncertainty of a novice, but with the quiet, confident, and deeply ingrained muscle memory of a master. It was as if he had been born for this, as if every moment of her life, every equation she had solved, every schematic she had studied, every dream she had deferred, had been leading her to this single, terrifying, and ultimately life-altering moment. The plane was still in its long, silent, and inexorable glide towards the sea, the altimeter unwinding with a horrifying, relentless speed. The cabin behind them was a cacophony of fear, of prayers, of the raw, untamed, and deeply human sound of 300 souls confronting their own imminent mortality. But in the cockpit, a strange, almost preternatural calm descended. Alara's focus was absolute, her mind a laser beam of concentration, her entire being attuned to the silent, complex, and now profoundly failing language of the machine. "Okay, gentlemen," she began, her voice calm, steady, a quiet, authoritative island in the turbulent sea of their collective fear. "I'm going to initiate a full manual override of the FADEX system. It will be a hard reboot. It will cause a temporary, but significant, power surge to the primary avionics. The lights will flicker. The alarms will sound. It will be disorienting. Do not panic. Do not interfere. Simply trust me." Henderson and Miller could only nod, their own considerable expertise now utterly, completely, and humbly subservient to the quiet, unwavering, and deeply surprising authority of the young woman who now sat in the captain's chair. Alara's fingers danced over the control panel, a blur of motion, her movements precise, economical, a symphony of human ingenuity and mechanical intuition. She input a series of complex, counterintuitive commands, a sequence she had designed years ago, in the quiet solitude of her own brilliant and then tragically dismissed mind. It was a backdoor, a ghost key, a hidden, almost forgotten pathway into the very heart of the machine's electronic soul. She paused, her finger hovering over the final, critical command. She took a deep, steadying breath. "Now," she said softly. She pressed the button. The effect was instantaneous and terrifying. The cockpit lights flickered, died, then flared back to life with a blinding, almost painful intensity. A cacophony of alarms, a chorus of electronic screams, erupted from the control panel, a symphony of a system in its death throes. The plane, which had been in a relatively stable glide, now lurched, its nose dipping sharply, its wings tilting at a sickening, almost unrecoverable angle. In the cabin, the passengers screamed, a single, collective, and deeply human cry of pure, unadulterated terror. But Alara remained calm. Her hands, steady, sure, moved over the controls, her feet working the rudder pedals with a fluid, almost balletic grace. She was not just flying the plane, she was dancing with it. A delicate, high-stakes and deeply intimate pas de deux between human and machine. She fought the plane's lurching, bucking descent, her small body straining against the immense, almost overwhelming G-forces, her mind a focused, brilliant, and unwavering beacon of calm in the midst of the chaos. She was not just an engineer, she was a pilot, a natural, a woman whose profound, intuitive understanding of the laws of flight, of the very soul of the machine, now transcended all training, all protocols, all reason. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the chaos ceased. The alarms fell silent. The lights stabilized. The plane, which had been plummeting towards the sea, now seemed to hesitate, to hold its breath. A new, unfamiliar, and deeply, beautifully hopeful sound began to fill the cockpit. A low, hesitant rumble. The sound of an engine, a single, magnificent, and miraculously reignited engine sputtering back to life. A cheer, a raw, unrestrained, and deeply human cheer erupted from Henderson and Miller. They stared, their faces a mixture of disbelief, of awe, of a profound, almost religious reverence at the young woman in the captain's seat, her face pale, her hair plastered to her forehead with sweat, but her eyes, her dark, intelligent, and now fiercely, triumphantly beautiful eyes, shining with a light that seemed to rival the very stars. She had done it. She had, with her intellect, her courage, her profound, almost mystical connection to the machine performed a miracle. She had brought them back from the brink. She had saved them. But the battle was not yet over. They had one engine. They were still thousands of miles from land. And the vast, indifferent, and now very, very close Atlantic Ocean still waited a silent, patient, and deeply unforgiving adversary. The quiet girl from row 17 had just won a crucial, decisive battle. But the war, for their survival, was far from over. With one engine sputtering back to life, a fragile, yet undeniable victory had been achieved. But the atmosphere in the cockpit of Flight 714 remained thick with a new, more focused and deeply professional tension. Alara Hayes, her initial adrenaline-fueled triumph now tempered by the stark, pragmatic reality of their situation, continued to work with a calm, almost preternatural efficiency. She knew that restarting one engine was a miracle. Restarting the second, given the nature of the FADEX software bug, was a statistical and likely practical impossibility. They were a wounded bird, a magnificent, crippled giant, thousands of miles from the nearest friendly shore, with a single, sputtering engine and a rapidly diminishing supply of fuel. Captain Henderson, Alara began, her voice calm, authoritative, the title now feeling not like a borrowed honorific, but a mantle she had, by right of courage and competence, earned. I need a full systems diagnostic. Now, fuel levels, hydraulic pressure, electrical output. I need to know precisely what we have to work with. Henderson, his own considerable ego now completely and humbly subsumed by a profound, almost overwhelming respect for the young woman who had just saved their lives, immediately and without question complied. He and Miller, working with a newfound, almost desperate efficiency, began to run the diagnostics, their voices a quiet, professional litany of numbers, of readings, of the stark, unvarnished truth of their precarious situation. The news was not good. Their fuel consumption, with one engine out, was alarmingly high. Their hydraulic pressure was fluctuating. And the nearest viable airport, a small, remote, and notoriously difficult landing strip on a volcanic island in the middle of the Atlantic, was at the very edge of their operational range. It would be, Henderson knew, a landing that would test the skills of even the most seasoned, most decorated of pilots. We can't make it, Miller said, his voice a low, despairing whisper, his earlier, brief flicker of hope now extinguished by the cold, hard reality of the numbers. The headwinds are too strong. We'll be out of fuel at least 100 miles short of the runway. But Alara, her gaze fixed on the complex array of screens before her, her mind a whirlwind of calculations, of possibilities, of 1,000 subtle and often overlooked variables, did not seem to hear him. She was not just flying the plane, she was analyzing it, seeing it, understanding it as a single interconnected and now deeply compromised system. She saw the patterns, the hidden efficiencies, the subtle, almost invisible ways in which the plane's remaining systems could be optimized. There is a way, she said finally, her voice quiet but firm, a statement of fact, not of hope. But it will require a different kind of flying, a different kind of thinking. She then, with a clarity, a precision, that left the two seasoned pilots speechless once more, began to outline a new flight plan, a new strategy for survival. It was a plan that involved a series of unconventional and frankly terrifying maneuvers, a controlled partial power descent to a lower, more fuel-efficient altitude, a precise, almost surgical manipulation of the plane's flaps and ailerons to maximize its glide ratio, a delicate, high-stakes dance with the prevailing winds, using their energy not as an adversary, but as an ally. It was a strategy born not of a pilot's training, but of an engineer's profound, almost spiritual, understanding of the laws of physics, of the elegant and often unforgiving mathematics of flight. Henderson and Miller listened, their initial skepticism once again giving way to a dawning, almost religious awe. They were pilots, yes. They knew how to fly. But this woman, she knew how the sky itself worked. She knew its secrets, its currents, its hidden, powerful, and now potentially life-saving language. It's insane, Miller whispered, his voice a mixture of terror and a profound, almost overwhelming respect. But just might work. It will work, Elara replied, her voice unwavering, her gaze fixed on the horizon, on the distant, invisible, and now, just barely, attainable promise of land. But I will need your help, gentlemen. I will need your eyes, your hands, your experience. We will do this together. And so, the three of them, the grizzled veteran captain, the eager young co-pilot, and the quiet, unassuming, and brilliant black girl from row 17, became a team. A single, focused, and deeply human unit united by a common, desperate, and unwavering goal to bring Flight 714 and its 300 terrified and now profoundly hopeful souls home. They worked through the long, tense hours of the remaining flight, their communication a quiet, professional, and deeply respectful collaboration. Elara guided, she instructed, she conducted. And Henderson and Miller, their own considerable, egos now a distant memory, followed, their movements precise, their trust absolute, their admiration for the young woman in the captain's seat growing with each passing, precious, and increasingly hopeful mile. In the cabin, a new, almost surreal, calm had descended. The flight attendants, their own fear now replaced by a quiet, unwavering faith in the mysterious and apparently miraculous passenger who was now flying their plane, moved through the cabin, their voices calm, their smiles genuine, their presence a soothing, reassuring balm to the frayed nerves of the passengers. The story of the mystery pilot, the quiet woman who had emerged from the anonymity of row 17 to take control, had spread through the cabin in hushed, reverent whispers, a modern-day legend, a tale of hope in the face of despair, a story that would be told and retold for generations to come. The landing, when it finally came, was a masterpiece of skill, of courage, of a profound and almost mystical connection between human and machine. Elara brought the massive, crippled aircraft down onto the short, windswept runway of the remote island airport with a grace, a precision, that left the ground crew, the emergency services, the entire assembled and deeply astonished world speechless. The plane touched down, its single remaining engine sputtering its last, defiant roar, its tires kissing the tarmac with a gentleness that belied the immense, terrifying, and ultimately triumphant journey they had just endured. As the plane rolled to a safe, final, and deeply, blessedly silent stop, a sound erupted in the cabin. It was not a sound of fear, of panic. It was a sound of joy, of relief, of a profound, overwhelming, and deeply human gratitude. It was the sound of 300 souls, snatched from the very jaws of death, erupting in a spontaneous, thunderous, and utterly life-affirming ovation. An ovation not for the airline, not for the pilots, but for the quiet, unassuming, and brilliant black girl from row 17, the forgotten engineer, the reluctant hero, the woman who had, with her intellect, her courage, her profound, and ultimately life-saving genius, dared to take the controls, and in doing so had not just flown a plane, but had, in a very real, very profound sense, taught them all how to fly. The aftermath of the miraculous and now legendary landing of Sterling Valerius Flight 714 was a whirlwind of international media attention, of official investigations, of a profound and deeply uncomfortable reckoning for the entire aerospace industry. The story of Elara Hayes, the forgotten engineer who had saved 300 lives by diagnosing and fixing a catastrophic software flaw that her own company had dismissed, ignored, and ultimately covered up, was a stark, damning indictment of a corporate culture that so often prioritizes profit over safety, that so often silences the quiet, inconvenient truths of its most brilliant, most insightful, and often most junior minds. Alastair Sterling, the formidable CEO of Sterling Valerius, the parent company of the airline, found himself in the harsh, unforgiving glare of the global spotlight, his own carefully constructed and deeply cynical world irrevocably shattered. He was forced to confront not just the near-catastrophic failure of his own aircraft, but the profound, systemic, and deeply human failures of his own leadership, of his own organization. The investigation, spearheaded by a team of international aviation safety experts and fueled by the undeniable and now very public testimony of Alara Hayes, Captain Henderson, and co-pilot Miller, was swift, brutal, and utterly devastatingly conclusive. The FADEX software bug, the ghost in the machine that Alara had identified years ago, was indeed the cause of the dual-engine failure. The report she had written, the warning she had issued, all so casually, so arrogantly dismissed by her superiors, were unearthed, their prescient, chilling accuracy a testament to her brilliant and tragically ignored genius. Heads rolled. The senior executives at the aerospace subsidiary, the men who had prioritized deadlines and profit margins over safety, who had silenced Alara's concerns, who had, in essence, gambled with the lives of hundreds of innocent people, were summarily and very publicly fired. Sterling Valerius was hit with a fine of unprecedented, almost crippling magnitude, but the financial penalty, Alastair Sterling knew, was the least of his concerns. The true damage, the profound and perhaps irreparable damage, was to his company's reputation, to its integrity, to its very soul.